Hello.
Hello.
Fantastic. Welcome, Bethan.
Great.
You know who
Hello.
Max is already, I think. Max, I'm not sure if
Hi.
you caught
Nice to meet you
anything.
face to face, sort of virtually kind of thing.
Honestly, just looking at the little interview Max Gladstone and Bethan Morgan there for a couple of minutes, I was like, literally still in a fever dream. What is happening?
Whoops.
Mutual. Well, wonderful to be here. Thanks so much for writing that
Congratulations.
story. It was great to read.
Congratulations on winning the contest, Bethan. It's fantastic.
Well, yeah, thank you so much to you for creating this astonishing award and opportunity and kind of wonderful new venture for writers. It's just like it's been the most incredible experience.
Well, it's my pleasure. How are you feeling right now?
I'm like still just it's the most surreal experience of my life thus far. Like I was telling people it was my first day back at work yesterday, obviously all still remote. And every time I entered a new call, everyone would go like, congratulations, because they'd seen it on social media. And there'd be inevitably someone else in the call who was like, what's happening? What have I missed? And I'm like, so every single meeting, I've just been like explaining what happened. And it's just like jaws dropping, like papers being thrown.
That's fantastic.
That's wonderful. Spreading joy. It's great. Have any of them read the story yet?
A couple have, yeah, I've had some really lovely wee comments, which is just
Oh, good. Excellent.
insane. Because like no one was ever supposed to read this.
I just want to make sure I'm saying it right. Is it Bethan?
Yes.
Bethan? Fantastic. So I think you both saw the call agenda. Basically, it's pretty straightforward. So Max, I think you have some questions to ask Bethan about her story and just basically have a chat. I've got some questions as well afterwards if Max doesn't ask all of them again. And then we'll close out the meeting at the end. So I'll just pass it over to you, Max, if you like.
Sure. I guess let's just start off. I'd love to hear something about the genesis of the story. Like, how did it assume its final shape? It sounded from, I was looking at your Twitter feed and it sounded like it was kind of a like full form, burst from the head kind of experience. Maybe you could just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's like 14 different answers to this question about like how exactly it
Right.
started. But I guess the first one is this book. This is How You Lose the Time War by Max Gladstone and Amal El-Motar. I mean, it's instantly became one of my just all-time favorites. I can't even put into words the effect it had on me. So I'd been following you on Twitter since then. And then in November, I saw you tweet that you were judging this new short story competition. And I was like, what? Max Gladstone's judging something? What's this? And then I like went through to the website and saw that it was this kind of brand new magazine with this like incredible award. And it was so interesting as well. It was the prompt that really caught my eye too, because it was really, really creative, and with that incredibly evocative image of the person with the two flaming torches and this little paragraph with all these kind of questions about descending into darkness. It was definitely one of the most kind of creative prompts that I've seen, and kind of unusual, I think, perhaps to see it as like with a competition. And I'd just been kind of discussing with some colleagues about Christmas shopping, and I was like, sometimes me and my sister do quite creative things, and I was like, she was like, I think I'm going to draw everyone like a bird of prey, because she's been working as a falconer this year. And I was like, I might write everyone like it'll be a short story or something. And then everyone was like, oh, you're going to write one short story per family member? How long is that going to take? And I was like, no, I'll just write one thing. I'll write a little kind of intro to it, give it to everyone. And then I was like, I'd seen your tweet and I'd read the prompt, and I was like, oh, I'll just write something for this, for like the faintest possible chance that Max Gladstone might get. So I just started like, it's the most self-indulgent thing I've ever written. I was honestly expecting no one but my sister to ever read it. And then because of Dark Descent, I was like, what's the darkest thing in the universe? Like black holes kind of instantly sprang to mind because I'm a massive sci-fi nerd. And I'd actually read this article back in September in the New Scientist about the black hole information paradox, which had gone straight into like my little percolator note of kind of cooking story ideas. And then, so I just thought of this kind of like a ship going into it. And then I was like, why is it going into it? And I had the idea of making it, someone like a sister following another sister, something's already happened. So there's like a real kind of gravitational tug, as it were, both physically and emotionally.
Yeah, it's a nice play off of the paired particle situation with black hole radiation too. I thought that was really great.
Because in the article, it goes into quite a lot of depth about Hawking radiation and the idea even of like quantum loop theory, and how, we don't know obviously anything about what's inside a black hole, but there's this idea that there could be a kind of instead of a singularity, like a bridge, a point where instead of becoming infinite, gravity just starts to slow down again, and then you come out in even potentially a new universe. So I could map out this little narrative arc in one of my many writing all-nighters. And then I started writing the story a few days before the deadline, and I got to 2,600 words, and I was like, I'm not even close to where I'd like envisioned ending it. So I was like, let's just calm down and make it like a touch more ambiguous at the end, which ultimately I think probably does just work a little bit better for the kind of like thematically. And I just ended it at the point of the ship kind of going in. And then it's the first time I've written a short story in a while, so kind of usually in novel form. But I just finished the Paper Menagerie, which I've got here, the visual aid.
Excellent.
By Ken Liu, which completely bowled me over. It's got some of the most impactful, like elegantly written short form literature I've ever read in my entire life. And they're all kind of like fantastical or science fictional to some degree. There's a lot of historical in there as well. And especially for his kind of like space operatic ones. I think it really taught me about just suffusing the emotional core into what, you're having to stuff, like to a certain degree, some kind of amount of plot into such a kind of tiny number of words. And all of these incredible like stories, which very much like are space operas, are all come down to like a son grieving a father, or like two lovers kind of yearning across time. And I was like, that's really, I think, what I've been completely missing. Because I was thinking is like, there's this great Stephen King quote about short stories where he's like, there's something else entirely. They're like a kiss in the dark from a stranger, which I think kind of just works really well for,
Yeah, I think that's spot on. One of the challenges and terrors of science fiction is that you have to get so much across to a reader who's equipped with, their general sense of how the universe fits together, and so they can rely on that in the way they can't necessarily in a pure fantasy story. If two suns rise, that necessarily tells you something about the universe, but you're establishing history, culture, characters' backstories, their families' backstories at a mile a minute. And that's one of the things I really love about this story, that you're telescoping in very closely to observed experience, and then pulling all the way back out to the level of technology and human migration patterns. It feels like time is kind of stretching and pulling the way that you approach an event horizon in this, and to get that kind of span, to sort of anchor that span compositionally, I think it's really helpful to have a strong human emotional core, and it kind of gives you a different sort of optimism of science fiction, maybe that there is something human that remains even as things become extremely strange or distant from our lived experience. Anyway, I thought that was really, really beautifully handled on a level.
But yeah, that's also one of the reasons why I like adore Time War so much. I'm just going to keep waving it every few seconds. Because
thank you, Mike. It's just in the back.
Because it's like this. It's a novella, really. It's not like 200 pages. It's this just millennia, dimension spanning, impossible war between these two, just like vast ancient civilizations, and these like two time agents on opposite sides of it. But then really it's like it's all a Trojan horse for this love story. And I was like, one of my favorite interviews about it is you and Amal with, I think it's the Vector magazine, the BSFA one, and you kind of mentioned about world building and how you were like having to come up with all this like stuff and all this scaffolding in order to not mention any of it, because it was all just the like just the background information. You just have to like have a sense of it there, which I just like, which I loved.
it reminds me when it works, and it doesn't always, at least on first pass. It reminds me a little bit of brush painting, of sort of Chinese ink brush painting. You get, there's a small fellow drinking tea down here, and then there's some bamboo, and then there's a cliff, and then maybe there's another tree off in the distance. And the rather than including the 200 pages of Olaf Stapleton style backstory, which is wonderful to read if that's the nature of the project. You can kind of give that same suggestion of depth by providing certain details that the mind orients itself around. And I think, again, it's that human element that really helps it all like pull together.
Yeah, and it was like that word, I think you said in that interview about, suggestion, which is why like this version probably works better of the story, because instead of like actually going into the rest of the narrative about what exactly she finds and then what happens from there. Just the kind of like the hint of it is probably like so much wilder than you could ever kind of, and then once you've given this one version of it, that is like the canon version, whereas every single reader is going to imagine something slightly different.
Yeah, absolutely, especially when the whole story is sort of turning on this leap into the unknown as we're approaching the end. And then even the style attenuates. There's the sort of richness and involved nature of the language sort of pulls out, and then you're left in the end with just these two people talking to one another, which is the heart of the whole thing anyway. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the discussion of leaving Glasgow at the end of the story. That really struck me, and it felt like a cool sort of extra opening of the concept. I wasn't expecting it anywhere, and it felt like a really beautiful extra piece.
Yeah, because it's one of the reasons I chose this particular black hole, because originally I was thinking I'll just make it the one at the center of the Milky Way, super massive, 4 million times the mass of our sun over expanse of space, which is like the orbit of Mercury. But then it's like 26,000 light years away, and I didn't want to have to kind of leap that far into the future, because I was still, again, because it's short, you're still relying on little things that everyone knows, like referencing NASA.
Right, yeah.
And I just, I wanted more of a kind of a through line. Also, because I was, it was just really fun weaving in all these kind of like different cultures, different space agencies, and having that as like a really tangible and still kind of perhaps realistic kind of structure for it.
Were all of those space
like,
agencies real entities? Are they all real, or did you do the thing where you say 3 or 4 real ones and then add in a fake one?
No, they're all, I said there's like 147, I think, that I referenced, which is way more than there are currently. But the ones that I kind of named, those acronyms are all real. I think it was like Nigeria, Japan, the US, Russia, India, Algeria, and maybe a couple of others. But yeah, then I was like, I could, still get to the center of the Milky Way, do it in a couple thousand years, but I really very much have to break the speed of light and just throw all of physics very much in the toilet, more than you are already dealing with black holes. And I was like, my brother who studies astrophysics will just kill me if I do that. So then I was like, what's the nearest black hole? Where is it? And I found this article just from literally last March. They just found the closest one, or what they kind of theorized to believe is the closest one, called the Unicorn. It's in this constellation of Monoceros, I think it's how you pronounce it, which is Latin unicorn. And it's like absolutely minuscule. They hadn't found it there before because it is so tiny. And usually you kind of find stellar mass black holes by looking at the kind of X-ray emissions, but this one's so small. You're just looking at what's happening to the objects around it. Wow. And there's like, the star was kind of wobbling. There's like an ever so slight gravitational tug. And though it might not be a black hole, there's still another theory that it could be like 2 neutron stars, or a neutron star and a white dwarf orbiting each other. There's this kind of principle called Occam's razor, that the fewer entities there are kind of creates a more feasible solution. It's usually simplified as like the simplest theory is most likely the kind of the true one. So they dubbed this black hole the Unicorn. And because it's only 1,500 light years away, I was like, great, I'll build this into the thing. So I was thinking, I referenced like Tyche and Kepler as 2 other planets aside from Earth that have kind of been colonized. So I was thinking over the next 500 years from where we are now, we can maybe have our first max exodus from Earth as they finally crack this laser solar sail technology. And then from there, we can just start interstellar travel and kind of crisscross our way there in about 2,000 or so years, which is where we are. So then I had this, when I referenced leaving Glasgow, this character, thinking about kind of all these family stories. And if each, like the idea was that they have these kind of like vast habitats, these huge, huge space stations housing millions, even billions of people traveling along these laser superhighways. You could still feasibly have quite a solid through line, probably linguistic based to kind of Earth cultures or Kepler cultures or Taiki cultures. So that was a reference to like her kind of ancient fabled ancestors having left Earth for that first migration via the superhighways to the first planets, and then these hulking space stations starting to kind of map distant constellations.
That's tremendous. Have you ever read any of Hanurai Naimi's stories or novels?
No, I haven't.
He's a, I think, Finnish by extraction author who writes in English, writes science fiction in English, and tremendous work. The Quantum Thief is the first of the trilogy. And he has an approach that's sort of kitty corner, maybe a little bit to what you're working with here. That's quite cool. It's big, explosive post-human stuff, but then you pretty quickly realize, well, the post-humanness of it is largely anchored in processing power. Everything's still taking place inside the solar system several hundred years in the future. It's just people have, massive simulated worlds that they're operating in or hiding secrets in or stealing one from the other. And another technique of his that I love and is sort of relevant to yours is you'll occasionally notice a bit of pop culture that's survived. Like a few immortals are hanging out and they're playing a game that's very recognizably like One Night Ultimate Werewolf or something like that. Or you get these bits of fossil expression that show up in the most alien of settings. And I love that the way that you kind of lean into what gets inherited, what gets passed down, what forms those links take, because they're not always what we would expect or what the sort of powerful forces would naturally expect. Like poetry propagates, language propagates.
Yeah, which is
Very
like
cool.
one of the questions I was going to ask you was about that, like intertextuality, or just like the idea of art within art, because in Time War you have this 17th, 18th century painting at the kind of really important kind of core plot line, and then you've also got the is it Travel Light by Naomi Mitchison that you mentioned, and then even in just like your new short story which I read, is it To Make an Ending?
Make an Ending, yeah.
There's this poem in the middle of it as well, which I was just so interested to hear more about, like how you approached that and that kind of that idea of this honeycomb.
That's a really good question. My gosh. All right. Well, let me think about it for a second. I mean, with Time War, there was this very real way in which it was like the way you're describing the composition of your story, really. Amal and I knew that we wanted to work on something together, and we always had in mind that we would publish it, or that we would try to anyway. But the first experience of it was sitting really across the table from each other, kind of typing at each other and then swapping. One of us would write the scene in which a letter was received, and then the other one would write the letter that was being received. We'd talk a little bit about the circumstances, but we'd never really discussed the emotional core of the story of the letter. So that would be a surprise, and it was really exciting. And we found ourselves writing to really just connect with the other person more than anything else, to sort of show off or share, or, oh, that was really cool thing that you just did, so maybe I'm going to try to do something related. And as a result, we were throwing in jokes and references and little bits of poetry and bits of art at each other, and just loving it and not really drawing too many lines. Also off of the theory that two time travelers would be at least as sort of over the top referential as the two of us were being as we were putting it all together, and not really out of a hope that anyone in particular would notice everything. More like, did you get this? Not trying to quiz anyone, but just the layers naturally accrete. The layers of meaning naturally accrete, or maybe just the in-jokes or something. I'm not going to run and get it right now, but one of my favorite editions, we've been fortunate to have a number of translations of Time War, is a Japanese edition, which at the back has some hardworking person in editorial at the Japanese publisher went through and annotated everyone that they could find. And so you look back and it's like, a little paragraph on the, Ottawa music group, Three Dead Trolls in a Baggie, that was operating in the late 1990s, things like that. It's really wonderful. I need to learn Japanese to figure out what they're saying about it. But I always think of, Amal and I both come to writing as readers, both of fantasy and science fiction and of literature in general, and pretty broadly and deeply. And I don't know, I always have the sense of writing as being like whale song a little bit, rather than, there's a lot of it, there's sort of day-to-day writing that's, like birds sort of chittering each other in trees, and that's great. But especially when you're thinking about, I don't know, novels and stories and stuff with there's a point at which you're no longer talking necessarily to the person who's right across the table from you, but you're talking to someone 100 years ago or 50 years ago who maybe can't read what you're writing anymore. And so your writing ends up folding around theirs a little bit and carrying it forward. And so maybe somebody then reads your work and follows it back and follows it back, and you have a sense of the whole thing is being passed along. I don't know if this is making a lot of sense. I'm a little frazzled today, but it's, so many of our words only have their meanings by accretion and transformation over time. Why is this called a mouse? The metaphors accumulate and solidify, and especially in science fiction and fantasy and in fantastical fiction. I think this is the point that Kelly Link makes in her introduction to Angela Carter's Bloody Chamber. You really are layering stories on top of other stories, and sort of only that. You can make arguments about hemophilia or whatever, but a vampire is only a vampire in fiction, and you can only recognize a vampire in a story that I would write because you have met other vampires before in other stories that other people have written. And to make unending, the short story that I published recently, there's a lot of Tolkien in that, and there's also a lot of me trying to think through reading the recognitions recently. So like, you're responding. I don't know. I often feel like I'm responding and playing, sometimes just purely playing the changes on a structural level. Like, oh, Ansibles are cool. This is a useful piece of technology to have in a science fiction story, and it's something that, fortunately, Ursula K. Le Guin has invented and has entered out into the universe for us to use. But there's also the sort of pure, beyond the story element, there is the intent, the dream, the desire that is making the story real, that has an effect and that also gets carried along, or something.
Yeah, it was, that pure angle of intent was another quote I was going to quote back at you by you in that interview, when you were talking about, like telling it to a certain person. But yeah, there's this like great Ted Hughes quote about every word being its own solar system of meaning. So like, I really love the idea of accretion, which is also very relevant to black holes.
Yeah, it's true. And spooky action at the distance. No, it's true. I mean, that's one of, I just love the image of the black hole, have since I was a kid, and I especially love the ways that they are inaccessible but are not inaccessible. That they you construct something that feels like this sort of universal devouring end of everything, and yet has real and yet organizes a solar system or a galaxy, and yet actually radiates and re-radiates out into the world, and yet is maybe as bright as it's possible to be once you get inside the event horizon, because of course nothing can escape and the light doesn't go anywhere outside of in. Yeah, I don't know. It's it's a wonderful organizing principle for a piece of short fiction too. And I think yours is rewarded by having had such a narrow angle. It's wonderful to have made this as a Christmas present. Have you run across the writer John M. Ford at all, Mike Ford, in your travels?
Yeah, but I haven't read any Ford yet. I love all these recommendations, writing everything down.
Sorry, this is, you talk about art in art, ekphrasis, I guess. So Ford is an amazing writer. You reach a point in adulthood, or like I reached a point where I felt like, oh yeah, I've read everybody. I'll be really, really shocked if I come across somebody who really blows my mind off. I feel like I've got a general sense of what the ecosystem looks like now. And then you read something, you're like, whoa, okay. Need to, I don't know, rework the constellations to fit this in somehow. The story that he's a wonderful novelist, and his work is now getting out there again after 20 years of rights confusion, thanks to investigative journalism and Tor books finally coming out with some of the stories that have been hard to find. But I just recommend hunting down a poem of his called Christmas Eve, Camelot Station, which I don't know if you feel a personal connection to the Arthur mythos, Matter of Britain at all, but it's a Christmas card that he wrote for his friends that won the World Fantasy Award back in the 80s, I think. And it's a just tremendous, the conceit is, it's Camelot Station, and all of the knights are arriving on their trains for the Christmas sort of banquet and parade. And there's discussions of basically everybody in the Matter of Britain and the kind of train they're arriving in and how they're navigating through the station. And it's a wonderful piece of fantasy and myth, and I don't know, right up there with To the Chapel Perilous for me for Arthuriana. So you're in good company, I think, is what I'm trying to say.
I had a question. I don't think we've talked about this. Why did you choose the archaic form of vanishing for the title and when you referenced it in the text itself? Evanishing, I had to look it up to make sure that it did, in fact, mean vanishing. And I was curious about that.
Yeah, so that's just good old-fashioned theft. That's taken straight from Robert Burns. He's got this poem called Tam o' Chanter, which is like the one I kind of decided to reference as this anchor almost for the protagonist to root her in something which brings almost kind of comfort and some sense of stability, like, thinking of, again, quantum entanglement and like clinging on to something as you're going into like oblivion. So she thinks of this poem, which I think I referenced her grandfather like also having like recited, which is one my grandpa also knows off by heart. So it's Tam o' Chanter by Robert Burns. And I think that there's that little passage just kind of near the beginning. It was one of his longest poems. It's like 200 lines when he talks about transient things. And I think they're among the most gorgeous lines of poetry ever written. He talks about like the like pleasures are like poppies spread, and he mentions kind of flowers shedding their bloom, about snowfall falling into a river, the aurora borealis kind of flitting here and there, never being able to kind of see them or catch them, and then this idea of everything just vanishing into the storm, and I kind of like that as a parallel also for this impossible point in space-time as like a storm she was kind of sailing into. I think I also referenced the character of Keok, the other pilot of the ship, when she there was a moment of eye contact, which was like a solar storm. So for me, I was also thinking of like her losing herself in the eyes of this other woman and being completely torn in different directions.
Very cool. I have a lot of questions, but I don't want to take away from your conversation. So Max, if you have more things to talk about.
No, we can. I mean, also if Bethan has anything for me, I'd be happy to keep chatting. And also, Craig.
Yeah.
I mean, I was going to ask you about language. Because I think it's that you taught Chinese in China. Oh no, you taught English in China. And I just loved that. I was just wondering whether linguistic study, or even like Mandarin in particular, like whether that informs your storytelling, or whether your approach to writing changed slightly after, you know, kind of having this swan dive, if you will, into a completely different language, and whether I guess also teaching as well. I think about like editing and how that affects the approach to storytelling. I was wondering, like, teaching must be quite interesting as well in terms of like how you just approach both language itself, but then also just the matter of story, and whether how that's kind of like affected how you piece things together.
Let me make a note. I wanted to ask you about editing also, sort of in that context. That's a great question. I came to Chinese as a child, not studying the language, but I read over and over again various translations of Journey to the West when I was a kid, and was really interested in the fantastical tradition in Chinese, and that led me to studying the language. And, you know, I was also interested in martial arts and kung fu movies and a whole bunch of things that, you know, feel very standard package to me sometimes, but I love them. And all of that led to me teaching in Southern China for a couple of years after studying Chinese. That was my major in college. And the Chinese language is wonderful in that in so many ways, it has the most, there's no way through but to memorize just an awful lot of characters if you want to achieve basic literacy, even basic literacy. And yet the grammar on, I don't know, second or third approximation, it feels very familiar to a native English speaker. That is, it's not a subject verb object language, but it's sort of a topic comment language, which can feel like a subject verb object language if you squint. Verb tensing is very strange, feels very strange to somebody who's been exposed primarily to European languages like I had, or is coming from Latin, and that hardly anything is inflected at all. The default, there's no tensing. You mark things in time, and then there's a particle that's used to indicate completion of an action. So if it's very important that somebody arrived in a place as opposed to is arriving at a place at some point, then you can use that. But it's not as heavily particled as, say, Japanese or my understanding of Korean. So it feels a lot like you're thinking about it in this way. Your sort of basic grammar ends up going through a mirror darkly, kind of, or it's just sort of a funhouse mirror. One thing I love about classical Chinese especially is that it's not as flexible as this, but sometimes it feels that almost any word can be almost any part of speech. There's a line that is to say, depending on a placement in a line or a couplet, a noun can have real verbal character to it. So there's a section of the Analects of Confucius, like in a good, well-ordered, in a well-ordered state, like fu, fu, zi, zi, and like wang, wang, like father's father, son's son, king's king. And you can sort of get the rhythm of it a little bit in English, but it's just the same word. Again, it's just one time it's nominalized, and the other time it's sort of verbalized. You can think about something really mountaining in classical or poetic Chinese in a way that feels very metaphorical in English, but has real like semantic force behind it. You don't have to make that extra jump in your head necessarily to think, oh, what does it mean to mount something? No, but of course we do this in English too, just with sort of slanted or chopped up words. Like something can mount to the sky very easily. It's coming out of the same root structure. So I guess I found myself, when I was teaching to students, thinking a lot more about the constellations of meaning that we're attaching to words. as I was struggling to explain maybe why you would do one thing one way and not the other, even though it looks exactly the same in the dictionary. And on the flip side, I was the sort of an oral English teacher, in that there is in the Chinese high school system, the mainland Chinese high school system, a formal track of English language instruction. And that's one of the things that the Gaokao, the college entrance exam, tests on. And it's very specific. It's highly technical, highly grammatical. So if I was to be taking the sort of main brunt of English language instruction, I might actually be hurting some of the students for their standardized test prep. So this is an additional class that meant that they were taking. So my focus was really on getting them to speak, which the traditional language instruction did not prepare them for at all. They sort of repeat back sentences that teachers had repeated to them. So it struck me how important a certain kind of courage was to speak in conversation and to deliver speeches, to sort of interact and move through the world, the sort of courage to not necessarily be technically correct all of the time, to be able to stand up and speak. And I think that's also very important for writing fiction, especially. I know a lot of friends, and I have a lot of friends who've had the problem of sitting down at the page and not being able to do the thing because they can't do the thing that's in their head necessarily instantly. Not being able to do, it doesn't have to be the bad version, but it has to be a version. It can be something. And that's a trap that I've fallen into too, from time and again. It doesn't work the same way for everybody, but that's definitely how it feels to me. So, and the flip side is I was spending so much time while I was in China, speaking Chinese on a day-to-day basis and reading English, but the books that I could get were often, 70-year-old translations of Russian novels, whatever was being published in, cheap paperback editions in the PRC in the mid-90s. So my diction got a little weird. And by the time I came back to the US, I ended up in places where I'd be having a normal conversation with a friend and I'd reach a word that I knew that I used to know, or a moment where I really wanted to say something in a Chinese kind of way, make a particular reference or flip something around, and just couldn't. So pulling my language back into English mostly, as opposed to English with a lot of Chinese in it or English with Chinese characteristics, was itself a challenge. And that was about the same time I was starting to publish. So maybe I've just never gotten better, whatever that means, since. So a long answer to your question, maybe, but
maybe it gives your writing a very unique flavor.
Who knows? I don't know. It's possible, or it's possible that it would be totally invisible if you handed both of these things to an artificial intelligence and you asked, like, tell the difference between this sample of Max and this other sample. Who knows? But I definitely feel that there's a difference, and I think that also just the experience of living over there in a very rural at the time place with students who had very different life concerns than most of the students I'd have had in the States, or most of, even coming from the countryside in the US, it was just a very different lifestyle and with very different sets of, expectations and concerns. So that had a deep effect on me. So Bethan, I wanted to ask you though, so you're coming, I see that you work in publishing, and you're in editorial, right? So like, how does that play with your sort of personal fiction writing? Do you find yourself looking at your work as an editor?
Yeah, it's really
or do you have to
strange.
turn it off?
Yeah, I do feel it's all a little bit of a masquerade in the day job, because I always feel like I'm a writer first. But it's also, it's a touch of privilege to be able to do this job. Because at the end of the day, you're helping like another writer like shape and hone their idea. But I do kind of feel that they're almost in completely different rooms in the brain. I've started out predominantly in crime fiction, which I think is like a really valuable place to kind of cut your teeth, because when you're a little bit more adrift from genre anchors, and it's all a bit more kind of instinctual, I think that's perhaps where just, you know, years, decades of experience of just, kind of unpicking story, suggesting different stitches really comes into force. But in crime, when you're just looking first kind of at the anatomy of a plot, it's such a kind of rewarding, it's relentlessly fascinating experience to like look at that blueprint and just move rooms around and hope that it will ultimately result in this kind of this foolproof structure, and then also kind of conversely from that, then working with the slightly more amorphous ideas of theme and voice. There's a really interesting tension and marriage between the two, and I think just getting really stuck into kind of the function of narrative. There's not many genres which are more kind of conducive to that than crime. I think fantasy and science fiction as well, because there's so much plot that you kind of, and world that you have to establish, and that has to kind of work like a molecular knot while you're also telling like a really this sprawling emotional story, which is going to bring escapism or, you know, resolution or some sort of the exploration of something kind of profound. So it does feel very, very different, and it's always first and foremost suggestion as well. You know, it's the kind of it's the mechanic versus the inventor, but I don't really feel like the kind of editing lens gets stuck on if I'm writing, but sometimes I do have to pull it back a wee bit when I'm doing like an edit letter. I just have to tell myself to just calm down, and bring it back to just the questions, the suggestions, rather than like, oh, you could do this, and then the dragon could, like, you know, take links. It's a daily fascination, and such a privilege to be in the industry, and also just to, you know, become really familiar with how it all works, how it operates. Obviously in the UK, but then we do the imprint I work at HarperCollins. We work very closely with our international teams in the US and in Canada, and other English language territories, and we also do a lot of world all rights as well. So we work with our rights team quite closely for translations. So it's a privilege, and it's so fascinating, especially coming in as this writer having somehow infiltrated the institution.
Do you ever feel like you're, you know, sort of a spy or sitting there taking notes?
I do, and I guarantee I'm probably perceived that way as well.
And I think you said that you wrote, I read somewhere that you said that you wrote this in a series of all-nighters. Is that how you normally work?
Yeah, I mean, especially since joining publishing, it is a beast of an industry, and everyone, there's a great over-reliance, and also the great non-secret that everyone's not having to rely heavily on kind of like overtime. So I think when writing, especially, also because it's in the same medium, it's difficult to keep that writing time really sacred and not let work, reading, or editing kind of bleed into it, just in terms of like evenings and weekends, which I'm kind of, that's a New Year's resolution every year, is to make those divisions clearer, which I think everyone shares. It is the great Sisyphean task. But so for this one also, I think like a deadline is so powerful as a driver. So I don't know necessarily whether I would have always kind of have to rely on the all-nighters, but it was a really powerful motivator for this one in particular. Just to, you know, get the words on the page, just going back to what you're saying again about just jettisoning perfection. And like Neil Gaiman said, you can't edit a blank page, which I think I really try and internalize. There's also like Donna Tartt scrolling the phrase like not perfect or this is not final or whatever across the top of all of her blank pages as well. It's just like to kind of to rob it of its power.
That's great. I only caveat that I have one friend who, I think for her, like she really aspires to perfection. So when she sits down and is trying to tell herself, well, this doesn't have to be the perfect thing, then she freezes up. She's like, but it must. I want it to be the perfect thing eventually. So why shouldn't I make it now? And so I think she approaches it more from a like, this can eventually become the perfect thing, whatever it feels like in the moment as I'm doing it. But yeah, if you're, it's sort of whatever gets in the way of the process, I think, right?
Yeah, I love that. I love that as a mantra. Like, it could be perfect, therefore it will.
Yeah.
Therefore it will. Do you have any plans to expand this story? Because there's obviously such rich history that you've built into the backstory and emotions. Do you have any plans to expand it into some sort of novel, or even take the same world with new characters or something like that?
Yeah, a few people have asked me this. It's kind of, I have this very nerdily named percolator in my elaborate system of folders, which just accretes stuff over many years. So like, I have this space opera project in there, and from it I pinched a few for this story, ideas like the interstellar highways with the laser powered solar sails. Because like for that, I had a cast of characters, but not quite the kind of main plot driver yet. And then for this, there was like a really kind of neat premise, which would work quite nicely. I think right now there's just not enough strands to it to instantly kind of explode out into a full novel. There's definitely like pieces which, especially in this completely wild long version I wrote, which takes you inside the black hole and what you find there, there's definitely elements there. And I think I will, with this space opera project I had going on, I'll probably develop it further in line with this, or even start with this as the kernel and then see how that then how that influences what I already had there. But yeah, that's kind of generally, I throw these like ingredients that I encounter into these pots and just let them stew. And that one had been more kind of like tech led. So now I feel like I've found characters and emotion. So yeah, I think I'll definitely explore that. But it's it's really interesting thinking about the different forms and whether they're innately translatable or whether some very much are more bound to their form. There's another short story quote I really love by the author Temi O, who wrote Do You Dream of Terror Too? And it's incredible, just pre-pandemic talk I went to with her, Stephen Baxter, and Peter F. Hamilton. And she said that for her, short stories are a bit of an enigma, and they're kind of closer to poetry than to prose. And I kind of feel that way too. Like I always just skew more into novel form because there's just too much. But here, because I think it was the prompt really that, kept me like on some sort of, plane of not being completely over the top.
In the gravity well.
It's really,
really cuts you off.
In the gravity well. I was searching for the analogy and it was right there.
Nice. Is this your first published piece, or have you published anything before?
No, this is the first one.
Fantastic.
I kind of wrote all through childhood and like various mad things, but they're all kind of still sitting in locked folders and documents. But the thing I've been working on since about 2015 is a epic fantasy novel. It was kind of inspired by the Mabinogion and like Arthurian mythology, and then this was like a lovely departure from that, just into short form, and then also back into sci-fi, which was more of my childhood sandpit. But yeah, so it's this is the first one. So it's the first thing. It's kind of been slightly more widely read, like kind of beyond family, which is an experience.
Exciting! Congratulations. Can you tell us actually more about your shape-shifting dragons and warring gods? And I'm unfamiliar with what the Mobagon.
Yeah, the Mabinogion. So it's kind of like the medieval matter of Wales. This originally kind of oral stories, which were then written down in kind of like similar to when Old English was starting to get its written record as well, around like kind of 8th, 9th, 10th centuries. And the oldest manuscripts we have kind of go back to that period. So it's really, I mean, it's from Mab, the Welsh word for sun or for youth. So it's kind of really ultimately just an exploration of family, and a lot of the of kind of more well-known tales in Arthurian myth go back to it. So there's like the one tales around Ceridwen, the kind of the witch with her cauldron, and kind of the wars with Ireland. Like there's this great one about King Bran and this battle that was waged with Ireland, and there's also a cauldron in that tale as well, which was kind of like sprouting warriors, like fresh warriors out of this cauldron. And then there's this character called Evanishing who eventually kind of like breaks it apart from the inside, which is an image I use for my story, and like the kind of the main through line of the gods and their war. So kind of drawing from that like larger framework, I kind of started with this cosmological structure first of how the gods and the mortals are related, and the two worlds are on collision course because there's this ancient god who escaped her prison to free her kind of grand accomplice. Meanwhile, there's this little clan on the edge of the mountains. Every human has a dragon, and this particular clan, they shapeshift. So you start with like a few different characters, and they're kind of like small matters against the grand backdrop of these like this god who's escaped and is literally about to unknit the world, and they're kind of drawn into this much bigger canvas, and yeah, I think it's kind of it's just come out of all of like my favorite books, my favorite strands of story, into this like massive mixing pot, and I've binned a first like multiple first drafts and kind of changed exactly how it begins, but I think I'm kind of near to where I think the final one will be in terms of like which characters we actually start with and like on what scale of the act should we start with, and now it's like much narrower, which I think generally works better, or is like an easier entry point into a very, very fantastical world, because ultimately it always comes back to kind of the emotional truths of the characters.
Sounds really inspiring. Very exciting.
I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, me either.
I appreciate
it. I'm sold.
It sounds thoroughly mad, and I can guarantee now that it is very much.
That's great. I definitely want to read that. Sounds right up my alley. I wanted to know a little bit more about you. In the short biography you gave us for the magazine, it mentioned that you play the violin, you boulder, you're learning Korean, and you're trying to match your sister's fluency, which seems interesting to me. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Because obviously you're not just a writer.
Yeah, I need to also formally rescind the phrase born in Scotland, I think made in London. I've received so much flack for that, and I need to categorically state for all and every record that I was made nowhere else but in Scotland. Yeah, so like I mean we're like a really musical family, and I think it's just all different types of storytelling that have just been around since the beginning of memory. Like my nana is the cornerstone of the Glasgow Music Festival. She's a piano teacher as well, and we always everyone had to kind of play something and perform it every Christmas in front of the family, which is an experience but very formative one as well. And then the kind of language has always been a bit of an enigma for me. I dabbled a little bit with Chinese in our final year of school because it suddenly became available as an option. So I did like the HSK1, which was just 150 characters, and it was very much the memorization, but I was just absolutely useless with the tones. And it's always the most embarrassing thing about being a native English speaker, is just how absolutely, useless
I agree with that.
We are generally with
tonal languages. I completely fail with.
But then, so my sister started learning Korean just last year, kind of in the midst of lockdown 1, I think it was that summer. And then within 6 months, she'd hit this degree of fluency. And so I kind of envisioning having to move to Seoul one day to follow her, I started this incredible course called Talk to Me in Korean, which is one of the most like just beautifully designed language courses I've ever come across. It takes you through it in such kind of digestible steps. Really, it took them like a decade to create this course, and even just like you start by kind of getting a hang of the alphabet, which is essentially kind of like phonetic bits of characters which you then put together. So you can, after just like a couple of hours, or for my sister, a half hour, you can get to grips with it, and then you can then read it. You're not going to know what it says yet, obviously, but you can literally pronounce it, which is felt like such a kind of tantalizing gateway into it. And it's just, yeah, it's such a gorgeous language. So I've been having great fun doing that. Just on the side, so those little kind of restorative moments from the howling turbidus of the last few years.
Is it because of your study of this language and because you were writing the story in part for your sister that you chose the Korean name for the main characters?
Yeah, definitely.
It's a Korean name, right? You said?
Yeah, so I took that inspiration from the first female Korean aviator, Hyuk.
Well, that makes me feel even worse for correcting it. Max, you probably won't know this, but well, Bethan, why don't you explain the A?
Yeah, it was so interesting. So from Korean has like 7 different formality levels, and it would be very unusual to say someone's name like out loud in dialogue without the relevant ending for formality, and that is appropriate to your relationship with that person. So whether it's someone you're informal with, Banmal is the informal language system, that's what it's called, and then Jondanmal is the slightly more informal one, and there's like 5 others, and then it can be dependent on whether you're related or whether it's someone older than you, or someone in kind of like a professional relationship, or someone you're intimate with. So it's really complex, but kind of all just works very, very logically. But then it tends not to be represented if you're kind of like outside of dialogue, if it's kind of written down, because it's just like a verbal ending. So it's so interesting to have included that in the dialogue in the story, and then to have it be read as a typo, because obviously it's something specific to Korean, in like Korean characters, to then render in English. You kind of have to make a choice about how exactly to do it, like whether you put a hyphen in there, which I think is the way which works better, or to just like drop it entirely. And I also wanted to kind of hint at the fact that they were both like the character, they would like speak Korean to each other as well, especially because they're on, I think I called it Gone 88, which is like a Chinese space agency developed habitat space station. So the idea is that they would all speak Chinese as well. And then I'd actually just started another visual aid, Pachinko by Min Jin Lee, which I'm adoring so far. And they actually do this as well. So that it's set in Korea and then Japan around a Korean family. But for the endings, in the English, they hyphenate it. And then it's not hyphenated, it's not represented in out of dialogue text.
I made a terrible mistake, is when I was reading it, I saw Kyoka in the dialogue and Kyok in the non-dialogue, the description. So I thought that we missed an A in there, and I added it to the 2 because I thought, I want to make sure that it's all the same. And I had to re-edit it and re-release a second edition when Bethan contacted me and said that, can we change that?
I know. That was just me being incredibly pedantic.
Well, no, it's important.
Hey, at least it got fixed.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm thankful that you mentioned that, and I learned something out of it. I was aware of that kind of structure in some of the various languages, but I didn't catch it there. It didn't occur to me. So yeah, it's great. I wanted to know, Bethan, how did you get your start writing fiction? Was there a specific book that you read that really kicked off your passion, or how did you get involved in reading and then probably writing after?
Yeah, it's one I didn't know I was in it until I was in the midst of it. As long as I can remember knowing how to articulate expression in language, how to physically write, I was writing stories. I had this like early saga called The Story of the Lost Man, which I would get a parent to like print out. And then when I was 7 or 8, I started writing this book called Ramosia. I was an absolute obsessive of ancient Egyptian mythology. I think it was like a portmanteau of Ramesses and Amos potentially, but there was unicorns in there as well, and this like sarcophagus device, which would lobotomize anyone with royal bloodline to contribute to this machine, which would raise an army of the dead from the underworld. And I would.
You were 8.
I had, yeah. And I had like a year of boarding school when I was 8, and that's all I would do was just write this story. I think it ended up being about like 30 or 40,000 words. But in terms of like my most formative childhood books, I mean, Sabriel by Garth Nix was an absolutely massive one, which I've got the little rune from the cover literally tattooed on me.
Oh, wow.
Which is published, I think, 1995. So it was kind of proto YA. The protagonist is 18. So it was kind of one of those early ones, which was very much written for a kind of a teen audience, all about necromancy and this daughter trying to save her father, which is a book I absolutely adore. And then Diana Wynne Jones, The Merlin Conspiracy, was another really formative one. Obviously all of Tolkien. And there was this other series called The Cry of the Ice Mark by Stuart Hill, which I still have found no other human who has read these as well, but I'm searching for my people. It was again this like incredibly raucous, expansive fantasy world about this 13-year-old princess called Thirin, strong on the arm Oakenshield, who has to go on this grand quest with this guy called Oscan Witch Son, I'm probably getting all the names slightly wrong, to unite the neighboring kingdoms against this invading empire, which was like roughly parallel to the Roman Empire. So they have to go to the speaking snow leopards of the north, led by Thar, and then to the vampire kingdom with the vampire king and queen. And I remember we had to do a book talk, and it was junior 2, which is like prep 7. I don't know how that translates. But yeah, it was like aged 11 maybe. And I did the talk about this book, which no one had ever heard of. And then I got classmates to come up and act different characters. I remember I had like the vampire king and queen were in like a Darth Maul character suit. So yeah, that was I adore those books. And then the Redwall series as well. There's a lot of like like talking animals and everything is a big through line, which is probably how I got to shapeshifting dragons. But yeah, there's like this, one of my favorite Twitter accounts is a Redwall bot, which just tweets like every hour food descriptions from the Redwall books.
Oh, those books make me so hungry.
Yeah. Like unparalleled food writing. But yeah, those were probably the most formative building blocks.
Makes me think, unparalleled food writing makes me think of George or Martin. I think a lot of his criticism was that some of his works are more menu than they are fiction, because he just goes on at length about the different foods, because he enjoys it and he wants to ground you in the smell and the taste of a place. Thinks that food is very indicative of a culture, and I think he's right on that too. But makes me think of that. Yeah,
there's definitely at least one Game of Thrones cookbook. Which is
I have it on my shelf, along with a beautifully illustrated book of Redwall. So,
amazing.
I think my final question, I don't have anything else, is what is the career what's your ideal career? Or do you want to be a novelist, or is there something else for you? Do you want to be an astrophysicist novelist, or?
Yeah, I mean, every 6 months or so, I do have my existential crisis about astrophysics and whether there's still time to do a little course correction in career. But then I just think, again, I think a black hole is like the most romantic object in the universe, because it is inherently unknowable, and that is the science fiction writers, Eden. And like I'd love the idea of in the real world 1 + 1 = 2, but inside the black hole 1 + 1 equals like an elephant, or rather like an elephant just beyond the horizon. You're both moving at the same speeds, you can never see it, and then it can shapeshift into a dragon, but you'll never know. I mean, shapeshifting dragon elephants are of no use to physics, but they're of inordinate use to the imagination, which is inherently where all science begins anyway. Like, you've got to wonder why the apple falls from the tree. So I think that's why, like, storytelling is always just going to be my my first medium, like my bread and butter. So I would love to one day be able to write full time. I don't know if I would ever, like, I'd probably always keep some sort of like part-time work as well. But again, like, also just having the experience of like being an editor in this industry is such a, yeah, I'll say again, it's such a privilege. So I don't know if I necessarily have like a really rigid blueprint laid out, but I would love to, yeah, just tell stories as long as I'm able to tell them, and that would be enough.
That's a great answer. Yeah, that's a great answer.
Start.
Yeah, good start on that. We love your story. Max, I'm not sure if it was impressed upon you how much of a fan Bethan is of your work. I think you have, Bethan, am I right that you have How to Lose a Time War, a plug pinned on your Twitter account? That's what's at the top?
Yeah, that was my pinned tweet from like a year ago. I just I think I tweeted like just a couple of times after I'd finished it, just saying like, there's what, 208 pages and 208 highlights.
That was you, yes. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
I think in your first excited email to me after you saw the magazine and saw that you won was you talked about how amazing it was that Max was the judge of the contest and that he even read your work and that you were, super excited. So I didn't tell Max in advance because I thought it'd be great to have.
I mean, I just splashed it all over social media anyway, but yeah, I just cannot impress how much I will just still not convinced that I'm not in a very elaborate week-long hallucination. It's just beyond comprehension.
So you're going to read last
Thank you so much.
Then. Max, I'll have to send you a signed copy. Keep volunteering you for this.
Yeah. Yeah, excellent. Certainly will. Well, send me an email. We'll figure it out. Line up the catapult. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah. That's all I have, Max. Did you have anything else you wanted to talk about or ask about?
No, I'll maybe follow up on social media or email or something. I actually need to go get my son, who's just waking up from his nap right now. I can hear him in the other room. But
well, congratulations again, Bethan. You'll stay on the call, but thank you very much, Max, for judging, for being here, for talking. And I'm so glad.
Pleasure. Great talking to you, Bethan. Yeah, thank you so much for that story. That was really fun.
Thank you so much as well, just for working us in around like your schedule and everything. That's so appreciated.
Yeah, real pleasure. Real pleasure. Talk soon.
Thanks, Max.
Thank you again.
Bye.
Bye.
Fantastic, Bethan. I'm so glad you got to meet him and have such a good conversation. I don't think this is one of the times where people say never meet your heroes. I feel like this went well.
I know. I mean, like, as it could have gone no other way with Max Gladstone, but yeah, it will take me many days, many weeks, many months to just come to terms with the fact that he read something I wrote and then wrote the commentary that he did.
That's great. I loved your get it tattooed on your arm or your face. That was fantastic.
Yeah, I'm still considering that.
So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now. And unless there's anything else you want to say to anyone who may watch this.
No, I mean, for me, it's just proved that like very much nothing is impossible. So like, I hope people subscribe to the magazine, read it every month, explore all these different opportunities, and never stop telling stories in whatever way they do, or whatever way that means to them. And just thank you so much again for
my pleasure.
Just this immense opportunity.